you want to go through the articles, or do you just want to start talking about the TV show? What do you guys want to do? It's democracy, sort of.
Should we talk about the show now, since we just watched it?
Okay, yeah. I mean, they go together. I mean, hopefully you guys read the articles for today, and so you should be able to draw from both of those articles in our discussion, and I would expect that you will. So what struck you the most with what is the central? What are the two central themes of this particular episode? Yep.
The first one was I think it was about like how the girls got a chance to like participate in the sport. I think that was one of the central ones, and then race and how that plays into sports as well. What I picked up on was when Tyra said you feel like a girl.
Yeah.
So like femininity, even in girls, isn't a valued trait. Like I think a lot of times feminists also like they're against femininity. Being strong means being masculine, and that's what we all try to like achieve, is like a masculine sort of personality, and anything otherwise is undervalued or like demeaned.
It's devalued, yeah.
Well, like, to go along with that, like, that's one of the things I picked up on, too, was that, like, the gender norm transgressive behavior was, like, totally okay for Julie, even when she, was skipping class and everything. Once her dad saw that she was going to be quarterback,
She
it was totally
QB1.
okay.
Yeah. As soon as, I mean, it wasn't that everything's going to be okay. Julie still goes on to get punished for cutting class. But what is interesting about, it's the class that they cut. Which class did they skip? PE, right? So it's also this, again, the show is trying to make a statement about the way that, what kind of athletics in a small town in Texas are available to women and are appealing to young girls in high school to play, right? Because PE class is generally not a place where you're playing competitive sports in any kind of meaningful way, right? It's just for physical exercise. It's not like people come to the games. Now, they do have the Powder Puff football game, and I do think it's interesting that it's Tyra who's the one who says, you throw like a girl. And I do think it's great that matches up with the exact title of one of the articles that we read for today, right? Because she's the one who ultimately makes this sexist, misogynistic comment. And the fact that it comes out of, it's very deliberate on the role of the writers, that it's not Tim Regan. And I'm sorry I didn't get into all of their names, but before we started watching the show, I hope that who I told everybody who all the characters were was enough. But Tim Regan's, this is important, is sort of the bad boy of the Panther football team. He's the bad boy, but he's an exceptional football player and a highly valued team member, so he gets away with a lot of shit, as it is revealed in his conversation with Smash at the diner that we hear them discussing later about how, Smash is basically saying, like, you show up drunk to practices and you threw a bottle at me once. Like Tim Riggins has done all of these infractions, and he still, he got kicked off the team for a short period of time, but then was invited to come back or he went and was allowed to come back on the team. And the episode right before this, a few episodes right before this, Brian Smash was dealing with doing some artificial steroids as a means of getting his body in better condition to try out for college teams, college football. And he got busted and he got suspended, and he basically had to claw and scratch and beg, borrow and steal to get his way back onto the team. And so in that dialogue between Reagans and Smash at the diner, where Reagans comes in and says, hey, you talk to your boys and I'll talk to mine, first of all, the implicit racial division that is so inherent and wrong about that statement, your boys and mine, meaning that, your boys are the black guys and my boys are the white boys, is already, really problematic. And it becomes the flashpoint for Smash to begin to really get as Waverly had encouraged him to, begin to take his blinders off. And again, the titles of these episodes is often really important to pay attention to. What was the title of this episode? Blinders, yeah. So, and again, that kind of harkens back to the notion of the gaze and the power of looking and looking relations, right? Blinders prevent us from being able to see and to see things as they are, oftentimes. But that was a little tangent that I wanted to get back to about going back to the Powder Puff football game, and the fact that the writers were very intentional that the phrase, "you throw like a girl," did not come from Reagan's. It did not come from Matt, the other team coach for Julie's team. It came from another girl on the team, and it comes from Tyra, someone who supposedly doesn't even care about football. And she doesn't really. I mean, throughout the series of the show, she's someone that really kind of hates the fact that she lives in this small town where the focus is on high school football and rejects that. But then as soon as she allows her rivalry with Lila Garrity to be fueled, that's what sparks her interest in, she ultimately tackles her and gets a lot of pleasure from it when Lila says, "Hey, this is supposed to be fun," and Tyra says, "Oh, I am having fun." So we see that the violent competitiveness come out in Tyra in that case. Other comments? Yeah.
I really found it interesting with how they portrayed the race because with Brian specifically, he and his girlfriend, they were talking about and even with all of them, they're kind of talking about macro things that were happening. Like whenever the coach says that they're inherently smarter, and then they kind of all come together and they all try to talk, and then how the girlfriend also talks about how he was born into this and it was a blessing to get brilliant. And they're trying to solve those smaller issues, and even in the next episode, they talk about how, if he would have gone fired, then it would have solved everything. But those are all really small macro things, and then I like how it's
Micro.
Sorry, micro.
Macro means bigger things.
Oh, sorry.
Micro. Yeah.
Those
okay.
are the micro level fixes to that. When then the episode goes in contrast that and shows that it's actually not that those little things are going to fix what the problem is, because if we use critical race theory, we can see that these are structural problems. These are things that are within the society, and that's what it's showing when you see his family going and trying to get the house, and they're talking about how we can't get the house.
Is who trying to get?
The Brian and his family.
Yeah. His mom's trying to get a loan for the house. Yeah.
Yeah, she's trying to get the house, and even in the beginning, she talks about how they can't get it because they have to worry about their health, and they have to worry about fundamental things that are supposed to come to everybody,
Right.
but yet they don't. And that's a society issue. They should have health. They shouldn't have to worry about those problems or house and even getting the loan. That shouldn't be a problem, because what they're using it for is something that's a fundamental right. You need to live, and you need to have these things.
Well, it's not like they're homeless. I mean, they have another house. It's just not as nice as that. Yeah, it's not like they're living in a car and they're trying to find a place to live.
Okay.
They have another house. They're trying to be upwardly mobile, though. They're trying to be more of the middle class, because where they live now is not considered one of the better parts of town.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
But they get denied the loan, and we do see the show pointing to, as you point out in that article, these larger structural issues. And I think that brings up a really good thing about what the authors Anderson and McCormick are saying in here about the problem with conceptions of race to begin with. For them, what are they saying critical race theory is? Anderson and McCormick. This ties back into our conversation about what happens on that football field and off, and within the school and the town. What is critical race theory? What is it? Yep.
Isn't it kind of incorporating intersectionality into the thought process of analyzing, like, I don't know.
A little bit, but it's a little different than that. So, first of all, let's go back and say what is intersectionality? First of all, what is this article about? Can anyone summarize this article?
They're attempting to highlight the similar situations of social struggle that both gay men and black men go through, the type of lesser perception of them.
Yeah, the oppression that both of these different groups face in the context of sports.
I kind of
Of
got the
team
feeling though
sports.
that they were trying to make it more, seem like gay men struggled a little bit more than black men, or is that?
And that is an interesting perception. I'm not going to agree or disagree.
Okay.
I'm going to say that that's an interesting thing that you got from it. Where does this article come from? Yep.
Based on like historical oppression for girls.
Oh, no, quite literally. What is it in the journal of? I didn't mean
Homosexuality.
Journal of Homosexuality. So you think maybe your perception on that bias might be a little bit right. They may have been focused more.
They're like, well, even though black people do this, gay people are this, like
Yeah.
I felt that a lot throughout the article.
Yeah, that's an excellent critique. Yeah, I've seen some hands all over the place. I want to get to everybody.
I was just gonna say it's like part of like the intersectionality theory in itself, because for intersectionality you have to be able to understand what different aspects of someone's social position will attribute to their perception of the world. So when looking at black homosexual athletes, it's not just that they're homosexual or just that they're black or just that they're athletes, it's all of those three things combined.
But they're also looking at just homosexuality and just black as well. I mean, there's a distinction there.
That's what I'm saying. I feel like that's like a mistake. Like that's why people may read it as, well, I think it's just because like it's different because they're homosexual and they're athletes. That's why.
Right. Yeah, and so the importance of intersectionality. So yeah, the article is basically, is doing that, and that's a decent summary. So what is intersectionality? I think somebody was going to answer that. You're going to answer that.
Like making sure to take into account like all parts of a person's identity, not just race, gender, like class, but like individually, but all of them in conjunction with each other, and how it affects the person's life and like people around them.
As well, yes, and so that would be embodied intersectionality, right? All the aspects of our embodied identity, but there's also social intersectionality. You said it first, and I blame you now, because now I keep saying it, intersectionality, not intersexuality. What is intersexuality?
Being queer.
Huh. That's a conversation for another day. So intersectionality, but also you have political and structural intersectionality. And where does this term come from? Somebody super famous right here at UCLA. Yeah, Kimberly Crenshaw, who they quote on page 951, describing it as forms of oppression, and again by oppression we mean discrimination, marginalization, or disenfranchisement, intensify when combined. There are many modes of oppression that structure an individual's identity, and that these ordering principles and these ordering principles are mutually reinforcing. Right. So what does this mean? This means that there's a notion of black masculinity that erupts in this episode that becomes highly politicized as a result of Mac McGill's racist comments. And what is that black masculinity that emerges outside of the football field for the black members of the team and possibly some other black men at school? Well, they become politicized, right? They become involved in passive resistance on the squad, and so it goes beyond just being defining their masculinity in terms of being a member of the sports team to being black men who are engaged now in political protest against broader structures of racism that exist overall within the institution of sports. Okay? So it does go, as you said, from the micro to the macro by addressing that. And we see the politicization of these young men engaged in really a form of what we would call passive resistance. You know, what was this? Oh, yep, go ahead.
Oh, no, it's okay.
Oh, okay.
I don't want
And we see also too that, you know, the notion of passive resistance as a means of avoiding any kind of violent contact. Football, in its very nature, is a violent contact sport. Can we all agree on that? Yeah. And you know, hotly competitive and so forth, and people get physically injured all the time. There's actually a lot going on in the news right now. There was a huge movement by the NFL to grant ex-football players huge sums of money beyond what an original cap was allowed in previous years for sustaining major and permanent injuries to their bodies while playing in the NFL. Because it is so violent and people sustain these long-term bodily injuries. We see them moving from a sport that puts them in direct violent contact with other bodies, right, to a form of passive resistance that also is reflected in the scene with Mrs. Williams and her daughter and her son. I don't know where that came out. With her son Smash or Brian at the bank when he starts getting really upset about the way his mom is being treated by the bank loan woman, and is getting very riled up. And it's not like he's going to take any kind of physical action. We don't think that he's going to do that, right? But what is his mom afraid of in that moment? Yeah.
It's like that oppression, like that's internalized where she can't even like speak up for herself, where she's just like, we're already black and starting this state.
She speaks up for herself because she says, "Oh, does this have anything to do with that little box you made me check that marked my race?" She definitely stands up for herself, I think, in a way that's somewhat appropriate. Okay, we got hands up all over the place. Yep. Is it Paisley?
Oh, Tip.
Tip. Okay.
Yeah, she just doesn't want him to fulfill the stereotype. It's what they call him, like, road dog.
The junkyard dog.
Junkyard dog. She's saying, you know, you have to, all these eyes are watching you. You have to think, like, outside of yourself. They're politicized. So she's saying your actions affect everyone else. They're all watching. She doesn't want him to fulfill that stereotype.
Yeah, and that's what Waverly is trying to point to earlier when she tells him about the burden and the blessing. And what is that burden? The burden of representation. That as a member of a minority or oppressed group, a single individual can come to represent a whole group, that their entire group, just by being in the presence of a dominant other, right? And that's what we call the burden of representation. A single individual ends up bearing the burden of representation for an entire group of people, which is totally oppressive and unfair, right? It's inherently unfair to individuals because no one person can possibly bear that burden, and yet it's not taken up by the person themselves. No one says, "I'm going to take up the burden of representation." It's something that's put on us from the outside, right? I certainly don't want to come to represent, you know, every person who, for example, I'm going to use a more innocuous example, but someone with tattoos. Yet oftentimes I am constantly asked all these questions about tattoo culture and why people get tattoos and the history of tattoos. I'm like, I don't give a shit. Like, and I don't want to have to answer your questions about this. Like, I'm trying to enjoy a coffee and a book right now, and I don't want to talk to you about tattoos or my tattoos or your tattoos or tattoo culture. So, and like I said, I deliberately used a very benign example in my example there. I could use others, but I won't. And so, yeah, so when Smash says to Waverly, you know, "I'm not Jesse Jackson," and, you know, she's like, you know, you can't, you know, and he says, "I can't be sidetracked with things I can't control," and she says, "Sooner or later you're going to have to peek out from behind those blinders." Yeah,
I thought it was interesting how, like, even thinking of inversion of representation, the role that the black coach was playing, because he doesn't really say anything the whole time, and he's like watching all of this happen, but doesn't really say anything.
yeah, he doesn't, you know, he doesn't have a lot, he doesn't take up a lot of agency at that point, as well, which I do think that is interesting, and not sure if that was deliberate or just the fact that the show was really expensive to produce because it's an ensemble show, and every time somebody has a speaking line, it costs more and more money, and I think there's a lot of voices in this show, and so that, you know, could have possibly come down to, at that point, financial constraints, because they give voice to so many of the other people of color on the program on a regular basis. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the first episode that I've seen, but I was really thrown by the amount of time and the like soundtrack sad music that they gave this white lady substitute teacher who was like, oh, I saw some racism today with these kids and it was so sad. And then like in the Smash is like trying to gather like his community and like in this church, and then they don't say anything. It's like 5 seconds of them like, yeah, let's go to church, let's talk, and then nothing. And
Yeah.
then the next thing we see is like they're all organized and stuff.
And again, we have a negotiated text here, right? We have a negotiated text, a text that, you know, a media object that is trying to say something about gender and racial inequality, not just within sports, but also within the greater institutions of high school and broader, you know, social and cultural reverberations of those inequalities, right? So the show's trying to say a lot. And keep in mind that, you know, one of the secondary titles for, you know, the class this week is called Melodramatic Masculinity, right? The show is very much a melodrama. It very much centers around that family of Coach Taylor, and so his wife, you know, she gets a lot of screen time because she's, you know, a more principal character in many ways, yeah. So there's those kind of production issues that you can also consider as well in terms of who has a voice and who doesn't on a program like this.
Also, what I picked up on was the power relations that exist in sports, and how even on the Powder Puff team, a white man, or a man even, was their coach, and on the team, on the regular football team, it was 2 white men, and there were no black men in those, or women even, in those positions, and that kind of related back to the McCormick and Anderson, where they talk about how there's a lack of black American men in managerial, coaching, and sporting occupations.
Yeah.
And you see that here also.
Absolutely, and as Tiffany pointed out, the fact that, you know, the one assistant black coach doesn't get even a speaking role in this really important issue, and this divisive issue that's really begins to tear apart the school. Also, too, just a couple last things that I want to point out before moving on is that, you know, what is a powder puff? What is a powder puff? Does anybody know? It's kind of an old-fashioned term.
It's what you would use to powder your nose, like
It's
in
for
one
makeup.
pair of-
Yeah, it's a term that connotes femininity by way of being an actual object that suggests something to put on makeup to look beautiful and attractive, presumably for men, right? So the fact that it's even called powder puff football is in and of itself, it's inherently sexist. It's just in the name of it, right? And of course, who's at that game? Who shows up to that game? Nobody. There's nobody there. It's not taken seriously. It's not a real, you know, game of football. And our women, and despite Julie's abilities as a quarterback, would she ever be allowed on the Panther football team? No. Right. So they don't really show that overtly in this episode, but they do it a lot by way of cross-cutting. I'm sorry, they do it a lot by way of transitioning through the editing. What scene follows and what scenes follow or precede the other scenes, right? So you see in this show, I don't know if anyone picked up on it, but I'll point it out to you in case you didn't, is that you have scenes where they're showing the boys' football practice directly cut, and next scene is the Power Cup football girls practice, right? So they did that kind of intentionally to sort of show that gender gap in terms of which sports are taken seriously, and in this country especially, the sports that men play, the team sports that men play are those that are taken much more seriously than female sports, right, historically. So despite many, many gains that we've made with the WNBA and women's soccer and women's tennis, for example, being some exceptions, but for the most part, the world of sports is ruled and dominated by men, and primarily cut across racial divisions where white men, straight, white, wealthy men are in positions of power in managerial positions, and men of color are those that are in the positions of the players who are most at risk for physical long-term bodily injury. Glad to see so many of you were taking that down. It was a little stroke of genius. Would have been good for a paper. You can use